pharaonic crook that the Pharaoh is seen worshipping, and the Pharaoh is the head of the stellar cult, the head of the Magi. So when you hear of these humble shepherds just happen to be watching their flocks by night, you can bracket that and realize it's about astrologers watching the heavens by night. But coded language was being used. And the good shepherd, just like the Pharaoh, is the Christ, seen holding the pharaonic staff, the crook. So there you have it. There is the chart of the earth, the position of the constellations, that unravel the literature, the grammar, the text, the explanations in the gospel story. It's a simple matter of astrology. Now this, we are only having time to just canvass this a little in this program. If you go to my website or contact me personally, look at the links page, we've got volumes of information on this, decoding each and every part of the gospel story, and even a lot of the Old Testament motifs like Jonah and Daniel, Samson fighting the lion, Jonah being swallowed by the whale, Christ walking on the water. So when you hear the Christians chanting and talking about following Christ to the cross, just realize what cross it is. Now Joseph A. Seiss in his Gospel of the Stars says, in the triad of the three great Egyptian gods, each holds a sacred tau or the cross as the symbol of life and immortality. So the fourfold cross is seen here on Ta, the ancient god of the Egyptians. And when you hear of Jesus dying on the cross, realize that it's the cross of winter upon which he is dying, to be reborn again after 3 days. Luke 23. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. Centurion is a coded message. It refers to Ares, the warrior. When the Ares, as the sun is dying, the centurion sees what is happening. He understands that God is dying, but that he's innocent. The entombment of Jesus into the cave or into the tomb is also referring to the southern signs. When the sun falls into the dark signs of winter, it's just a symbol of entombment. You find this in the story of Lazarus. You find this in the story of Osiris, and all the Christ saviors of the world go into the dark place for a sojourn, from which they will rise again. And on the third day I shall rise again, said the Christ. The third day can be looked at as the 3 signs from Capricorn to Aries. The 3 signs from the depth of winter to the spring. Okay? Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. We're thinking of 3 days, 3 seasons, 3 periods of time. And importantly, we know that Cancer is the mother of God, but you see in all the Renaissance paintings, you often see the 2 mothers of Christ. This is a very common motif in ancient art. The 2 Marys at the foot of the cross. Well, the 2 Marys are Mary, the mother of God, and Mary Magdalene, but we have a Martha and a Miriam turning up. In the Old Testament, we have the 2 primordial females of Eve and Lilith. In Greek mythology, we have the syzygy in the form of Demeter and Persephone. But guess where they come from? They come from the old Egyptian Isis and Nephthys. They come from Ta'urt, the original mother goddess of 25,000 years before. There you can see the picture of the hippopotamus god in the center of the zodiac, the planisphere. The earliest depiction of the mother goddess was the hippopotamus. And the name of that deity was Ta'urt, from which we get the word tarot. We also get from Ta'urt the word church, charuch. When the hard T's are softened to CH's, Taruch becomes charuch. So the Holy Mother Church. Christians talk about Holy Mother Church. They dress in flowing robes of the female because they know what we're not supposed to know, is that this is a throwback to the ancient goddess cults of the ancient world. And if you suppress that and throw it away completely, that's no good for the psyche. You can't control people. You have to have something they recognize and will yearn towards. That's how subliminal manipulation works. So they know they're a male patriarchy, but they've got to encompass some of the feminine motifs. Well, that's all right. We'll just dress ourselves up as female, build churches with womb-shaped doors, and have the waters of the female as the baptismal fonts, and use all those symbolisms, but nobody knowing where it originally originates. And we'll talk about Holy Mother Church and Virgin Marys, but let nobody ask where it all comes from. The original Virgin Mary was Ta'urt, later as Nuth, later as Isis, then Sophia, and down to Mary, the original heavenly Madonna. There's even talk of the Black Madonna. Of course she's black, because the night sky is dark, is black. It's not that there was a physical black Madonna walking around. The Black Madonna is literally the night sky that gives birth to the sun every year, every morning. In the Far East, we find the Virgin with her little child, Krishna, Rama, and the cow goddess. We have Lord Krishna, who is the prototype of Lord Christna, or Christ. We have in the later Arthurian legends Lady Nimue and her son Lancelot, the great solar king, the solar knight, and the Lady of the Lake. The inscription for Jesus, IHS, which is used on churches and by Christians, actually is nothing to do with Jesus. It comes from Bacchus. In the ancient languages, IHS simply stood for the word Bacchus. There's a tie-in to Orpheus. We think that Orpheus is a Grecian motif that came later than Jesus, but that's not true. Orpheus is a primordial deity. Orphe, Ophion, OPH represents the serpent. And of course there's a whole underworld story relating to the great god Orpheus. And Dionysus, there's a tie-in with Jesus and the cult of Dionysus. In Arthurian mythology, one of the most beautiful and poetic of the myths of Arthur is that concerning Sir Tristram, or Tristan, of sorrowful birth. But the word Tristam, or Tristna, comes from Krishna, which goes back to Jesus Christ. There's a connection. They all have evil uncles. They all have followers. They all have a sorrowful birth. There's many motifs that they have in common. There's a tie-in with Jesus and the cult of Zoroaster in Persia, and also the Persians Mithras and Ahura Mazda. Tony Bushby says that the similarities between Christianity and Mithraism in the 5th century were so striking that St. Augustine grudgingly confessed the priests of Mithra worshipped the same deity as he did. But in Egypt, we always find Aten and Ra, the sun gods. We find out from Kersey Graves' great book, the world's 16 crucified saviors, a highly suppressed book, to say the least. Kersey Graves was a scholar, and he found out that there was in the world at least 16 crucified saviors. All died on crosses, all were born from a virgin, and all came to bring light to the world. We don't have time to go into all the details of the Bible stories, but on the website, on the pages that have to do with astrotheology, you will find the astrological or astrotheological analyses of many of these biblical images of the 3 wise men and the 72 disciples and the marriage of Cana and so on. Now we know that Jesus had the 12 disciples, but we also read in several parts of the Gospels that he had 72 apostles, those who would go about without scrip nor purse. In Luke 10, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. The 72 apostles. Well, that's all astrology, astronomy, astrotheology. We know about the 12 official signs. The 12 signs of the zodiac are the 12 disciples of Jesus. But there are many other constellations up there. We talked about the sun passing through the zodiological belt. That's a band about 17 degrees wide. And the sun passing on that year after year, that's the zodiac belt. But in and around the zodiac belt, in and around the other main 12 constellations are other constellations, some of them of great importance. They may not be important to us now in solar-centered astrology, but to sidereal astrologers, to the ancient stellar cult, they were equally important. Now these many constellations, and there's about 72 of them, they are known by names and they're worshipped and they have great symbolism attached to them. And there are 72 of them. Those are the 72 unofficial disciples or unofficial apostles that also served the Christ or the Son. Now the early church fathers prohibited astrology. and the Council of Toledo banned it forever. Nevertheless, 600 years later, the dates of the Pope's coronation were determined by the zodiac. The church hierarchy employed their own astrologers, and signs of the zodiac appeared all over the church furnishings: tiles, doorways, manuscripts, and baptismal fonts. And we might remember at the turn of the millennium in 1999 to 2000, the Pope John comes out to make his apology, quote unquote, to the Jewish people. Well, he chose Pisces to do it in. It was in March. And if you track all of these different ceremonies that the Pope is involved in, you will find that they have astrological significance in order to strengthen themselves. We find out in Ireland that when the Vatican servants there wanted to give the Pope's chair a clean, and we know that the Pope's chair is the famous chair of St. Peter, which had gathered so much debris over the centuries, so they took it away to refurbish it and give it a good clean. And when they took off all the debris, what do they find on the chair and the seat is a huge zodiac in brass. This incredible zodiac. So they quickly covered it over again because, of course, you don't want anyone to know about that. Holger Kirsten in the original zodiac, in the original Jesus, says that the Jesus mediated to us by the church is not the true Jesus. That is an artificial construction, assembled from true and false fragments of his biography, from authentic and invalid statements, and based on a great deal of inventiveness on the part of the Christian writers. He says that the religious teaching presented in Paul's epistles is fundamentally different from what research has recognized as being authentic sayings of Jesus. What we know as Christianity today is not the teaching contained in those authentic sayings. It is the theology disseminated by Paul and the doctors of his epistles. That's right, with the Romans paying the bills. Burton L. Mack, in Who Wrote the New Testament, says the writings in the New Testament were not written by eyewitnesses of an overpowering divine presence in the midst of human history. The Christian Bible turns out to be a masterpiece of invention. To be quite frank about it, the Bible is a product of very energetic and successful myth-making on the part of those early Christians. And T.W. Doane, in his book, says the canon of the New Testament is nothing more or less than a copy of the mythological histories of the Hindu savior Krishna, the Buddhist savior Buddha, with a mixture of mythology borrowed from the Persians and other nations. Now we know the birth of Jesus we've looked at, but we also hear a very specific detail. Christ dies at age 33. Well, the answer to that is again concerning the precession of the equinoxes. The sun passes backward through the zodiac, remember, and moves through each of the 30 degrees in approximately 1 month of 30 days. So, on a daily routine, it takes 30 days to move through one sign. It comes into a sign at the first degree and is completely out of the sign by the 33rd degree. That is why Jesus, the Son of God, was said to have died at 33. It is also why there are 33 degrees within Masonry. Freemasons are the descendants of the stellar cult. So we have Jesus, our Father who art in heaven, referring himself to the sun, to Venus, to the morning star. The sun is 3 degrees in the sky. A sign is 30 degrees. In order to move 30 degrees, but to completely leave it, it's about 33 degrees. Let us understand also that when the sun god falls, he falls into the female signs. And although the Christians did a lot of heavy duty work to denigrate that, the idea was that the son is born in the virgin and he dies and goes back to the virgin, to the mother. That is the night sky. Forever he is encompassed in the body, the womb of the night sky. So at this stage of our program, it is not outside the bounds of reason, after what we've been showing, that we have to understand that the Gospels are not a biography. The Bible was and is nothing more, nothing less than an astro-theological story, a sidereal myth. I believe that the writers of the Bible knew that. They had no intention of ever presenting it as anything else. And they would have been astounded that modern generations would actually think that it was a biography. Because if you were actually trying to create a biography, you would have done a much better job than the one that we have coming down to us. Even with all the machinations and throwing away and burning of other books, you still would have made it look more officially like a biography if that had been your intention. But the allegorists of the ancient world knew that everyone knows that this is a fable, a story. They would have not been able to even comprehend how this literally would have been taken so literally, and that the real, pure, beautiful, intriguing and mysterious meaning of it would just have been thrown out with the trash. This can be confirmed because if one substitutes the words zodiac and constellations for the following terms, the scriptures will begin to reveal their secret meanings. What terms? You can take a lot of them. Tabernacle, New Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Hall of Judges, Kingdom of God, Tent of God, Flocks by night, Aeons or ages, Seasons, Oracles, Citadel. So he or she entered into the tabernacle. We have the 7 churches, the Mount of Olives, Mount of Glory, City of David, Celestial City, Heaven, Throne of the Elect, Abode of the Most High, the Labyrinth, the Most Holy Place, Mercy Seat. Whenever you meet or encounter these strange, cryptic, untranslatable terms in the Bible, just in your mind, substitute the word constellations or zodiac and see what happens. You might be amazed. Now, the dramatis personae of the Old Testament are not biographical characters. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Solomon, David, Samson, Joseph, Daniel, Jesus, and all the other patriarchs originally symbolized alignments and conjunctions between the planets and the luminaries. Their many wives, their sons and daughters simply represent degrees and minutes of zodiacal arc. So that's right. When we read about these patriarchs and their wives and their many sons and daughters, let us understand that this is another coding system. Everybody's running around trying to find how to break the code of the Bible, and yet these most important codes nobody pays the slightest attention to. These patriarchs, nobody's ever found any history of them, that they ever even existed. And we're not going to be able to decode this Bible until we understand how it works. So when you hear about Abraham coming unto the Pharaoh, or Moses appearing to the Pharaoh or any king, I'm just giving you one example here, the kings of the world were always represented by the sun or by Jupiter. The rabbis and the Semitic people really preferred Saturn, as we saw. So when the Saturnian patriarch, Moses, David, Abraham, Solomon, comes to the Pharaoh, as an example, we're talking about a conjunction of some kind, an aspect between the planets Saturn and Jupiter. The amount of daughters and sons they have are minutes and degrees of arc. So this whole thing can be decoded. There are scholars who are working on this right now to decode the whole of the Old Testament. Now, as I said, the potentates know this. Pope Leo X, it has served us well, this myth of Christ, he said. If we look on the internet to gospelnet.com, this is a Christian website featuring the Bible. What do we find as their logo? The rising sun. Not Jesus, not a picture of the Christ, not a cross, but the Son of God, the sun in the sky, is the logo of gospel.net. How interesting. We have the very dramatis personae of the Bible, as I said. You can decode it. God is the sun, obviously. There's no female of any significance in the early part of the Old Testament, so we just start with God, the Son. His son, Adam, corresponds to the male sign of Aries, which is always shown as the bulky, phallic male, the aggressive warrior. That's Adam, the first son. Eve can be Taurus. Taurus is the female sign ruled by Venus, the earth sign of Taurus, which is always feminine. And then they have Cain and Abel. They're twins. And what do we have after Taurus? Gemini, the twins. And Cancer that comes after that is the first Holy Family. They make up the family, which is known as Cancer. Then comes the conflict between the brothers. That's Leo, the time of conflict, and so on. This has a very modern context, though, because this reminds me of the speech that Gore made in Weapons of Mass Deception. In this series, we go into the occult history of the politicians and make reference to that. In one of the addresses that Gore, Vice President Gore, made when he was with Clinton, I happened to notice, and this is common that I notice this with politicians, they use old archetypal motifs. In the speech that Gore was making, he literally went through the signs of the zodiac, meaning he used terms and passages that related. He talked about independence and the war on terror and the need to be strong, and that's of course Aries. He talked about the budget and how they have to always solve the economical problems, the financial world. That's Taurus. He talked about coming together and problem solving, which is a Gemini type of understanding, connectivity. He talked about the family, as they always do, and healing the family and making sure they all have Medicare and whatnot. That's Cancer. He bypassed Leo because Leo is him. The idea of the solar king doing the talking and the pride and all of that, and the pride of America. But he moved on to Virgo, which talked about sacrifices and also talked about the medical world, and that they're going to take care of that. And all the way over to Libra, you know, where they're talking about stretching their arms out to the allies and bonding with allies and all the rest of it. If you listen to that speech, every one of the signs of the zodiac was subliminally implied. So God is the sun. But Samson was the sun. In fact, the word Shamash, Samson in Hebrew, Shamash means the sun. It's so literal. Daniel in the lion's den, fighting the lions or being saved from the lion. The whole idea is Leo based, that the son of God is passing through the trials of the sign of Leo. Because like Hercules, you go through the 12 signs if you're the hero. Decoding the Bible is very important when we understand that the sons and daughters represent degrees of arc, and that the patriarchs can also represent the great planets. But you see, earthly, terrestrial matters, like I give the example of Gore. Terrestrial matters are based on celestial. A very important historical anecdote in Irish mythology is the coming of King Billy, William III of House of Orange, destroying the Stuarts. But where did they decide to fight this battle? On the River Boyne. On the River Boyne, not far from Newgrange, literally the oldest monument, the oldest pyramidical structure, or the oldest domain in the world, the oldest ancient site known to man. They have their great conflict there. What's more is that when the horse, this great white horse that the King William was riding, entered into the water, at precisely that moment, the planet Jupiter was moving over the Milky Way. The Milky Way is known to be the great river up there, the river Styx, the river of the heavens. So somebody is counseling the king. Everything is done with the idea of protection, the use of the old Sabian magic. In the Bible, we're always hearing about the Word of God and the sanctity of the Bible itself. Of course, our modern clergy and religious representatives are always declaring that belief in and practice of the divination arts like astrology is sacrilegious and absolutely forbidden. Yet they confer names and titles upon themselves which clearly originate from the stellar, lunar, Saturnian and solar cults. On my website, if you visit it, you'll find that there's a detailed analysis there of exactly this point, that the word pastor, master, minister, ceremony, deacon, cardinal, sexton, the word nun and the word monk or monsignor, monastery, all come from these ancient cults. We talk about a monastery. That's where monks and religious people will go. But what does the word monastery mean? Mon is moon and stir is the stars. The place of the meeting of the moon and the stars, a monastery. But you try going in there and going, hey, do you guys practice astrology? They're liable to sprinkle holy water on you, tell you to get thee hence. What they don't tell you is that a deacon, which is a clerical duty, a deacon comes from the word decan, D-E-C-A-N, which is a division of the zodiac into 10 degrees. The decans, the deacanates. They don't tell you that a sexton comes from the word sextant, which is a navigator's tool to do what? Measure the stars. A minister is a moon and a star. Mr. Minister is literally saying the man of the moon and the stars. Or monarch and patriarch and archbishop. Mystery. Christians are forever telling you there's a great mystery. But the one thing they don't tell you is what the word mystery means. The word mystery comes from mesta or mista, which meant woman. In Egypt, the word for woman was mesta, M-Y-S-T-A or M-E-S-T-A. So the great mystery is concerning the female. We have the magistrate or the magistrate. That's right. You go to court, you have 12 jurors because you have 12 watchers. You have to be in balance. So the 12 watchers are the 12 signs of the zodiac. But the 13th sign of the zodiac is the magistrate. When you go to court, you're in the 13th sign of the zodiac. You're out of the normal procedures. You've been sequestered away, and you're under judgment of Saturn, the 13th sign of the zodiac. Countless English place names contain the stir, S-T-E-R, as star. So Chester, Gloucester, Rochester, Worcester, Dorchester, Chichester, whatever, all the stirs. It's under the stars, because all cities were founded by the Magi, by the Druid who would come there and plant his wand, and he'd look up and he'd study the heavens and he'd say, what constellations are rising and setting here? What does the sun do? What are the primary constellations and stars? And then they'd say, this is Manchester. This is Dublin. This is Belfast, under this particular star. And these terms are absolutely conspicuous in Ireland. On the website you'll see that I go into the meaning of Ulster, Munster, Leinster, Connaught and Meath, the divisions of Ireland. Now the word of God, we find that in the Bible, the very word we use, amen, amen, at the end of a prayer, we say amen. Amen is literally Amen Ra, of the Egyptian pantheon. The God of the Hebrews is Adonai, but that comes from the sun god Aton. The T becomes a D. In the Egyptian, there's the prayer that opens, Amon, Amon, who art in heaven, in Egyptian. The word Adam comes partly from Atum. Atum is the first Egyptian deity. So that's the very first male god of the first pantheon, the first dynasties of Egypt, is called A-T-U-M, Atum. That is where we get Atman, the Hindu idea for the soul or the embodied soul, the great spirit, Atman. It's Egyptian, it's Atum, and the Hebrews pick it up and it becomes Adum or Adam. Christmas Day, as we saw, December 25th, was really the birthday of Horus. January 6th was the birthday of her second son, Isis' second son, brother of Horus, Aeon. And January 6th is where the Hebrews worship their festivals. Joseph, the father of Jesus. Joseph, Julius, Julian, Julio, these names come from Julio or Yule. In English we say wheel. December is the birth of the sun. The Yule tide is the time of Christmas. And Yule meant wheel. That's where we get the word wheel from, because the zodiac was a wheel. So the father of Jesus, Jehoshaphat, is the wheel, the Yule. The father of Jesus is the zodiac. Jesus and Joseph are carpenters, but this is a mistranslation from Nagar, which really means the learned man or the wise man. Jesus at 12 years old is referred to as the Most High. In the Bible he's referred to as the Most High. Well, the sun at the noon position of 12 o'clock is the original Most High. When you see the Eucharist at the most important celebration of the Christian Mass, the Eucharist, when the little solar disc, the little white disc, is held right up above the head of the priest, that is the time of the sun reading the 12 o'clock noon position. That's all it represents, is the sun at the Most High position. As we said, Christ comes from the Egyptian karast, meaning made flesh. All right, so the word is ancient. It comes from the word karast, meaning to be made flesh. It also means, as a secondary meaning, to be anointed with oil. The Christ is to be the oiled one or the baptized one. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is not my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It actually derives originally from Ilahi, Ilahi, or Hele, Hele, or Helios, Helios, Son, Son, why hast thou forsaken us and covered my face with darkness? There is also the Hebrew version, Eli, Eli, lama azubathani, meaning, my God, how dost thou glorify me? Water turns to wine in the story of the marriage of Cana. Well, this occurs at the Feast of Cana in Egypt when the vines are harvested. Remember we said that Cana in the stellar cult was the name of the serpent. It's a great serpent festival of the serpent cult. When the wine, the vines are being harvested. And of course, if you take the vines, how do vines get to be vines? From the water of the Nile and from the rains that have fallen. So the Egyptians used to say that the grapes are the wine, the water transferred into wine. It's as simple as that. And the master of the harvest would always raise a chalice of the wine to his lips, the new wine, to taste it. And if it was good, he would exclaim, behold, it is finished. Just like we hear Jesus saying on the cross, behold, it is done, or it is finished. But these terms come from way before Christianity. Now the 4-day ceremony around the resurrection of Jesus was based on the raising of Osiris by Isis. Osiris was killed on a Friday after the spring equinox and raised on the sun day. But it was done with Osiris and Isis before. Lazarus comes from the Egyptian La Asuras. Asura is the Indian Surya, which to this day means the sun. But Asurya was actually the old name of Osiris. They didn't pronounce it Osiris, they called him Asurya, the sun. The Indians have Surya, the sun. Lazarus, coming out of the dark tomb, wrapped as a mummy, Christ said he's only sleeping, he'll come forth as a sleepwalker. It's Osiris, coming out of the underworld, coming out of the tomb, being born again. Nazareth, Jesus is meant to be born there, but never on any map have they ever found it. There's no locale called Nazareth. The word derives from the Egyptian Nasir, meaning prince who is sent, and also from Nasir, meaning Sirius. It was Jesus of Sirius. We hear in the Bible, come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will refresh you. However, what we're not told is that is a statement that comes from the doorway of the temple of Dendera in Egypt. The temple of Dendera was sacred to Isis. Isis was the one who said, come unto me with all your burdens, and I will rest you. Not Jesus. We talked about the stellar and the lunar cult. But what about the Saturnian cult? The worshippers of the planet Saturn. We mentioned that their god was El, E-L. And that's why we find this term, this prefix or this suffix, so common in the words that have to do with religion. We have a tempel, a circle, a gospel, a disciple, an apostle, an evangelist, or Elohim. If you were some bigwig in the Saturnian cult, you were known as an elder or an elite because you had the light of Saturn. Saturn was being nice to you and he had enlightened you, and now you would be called an elite. Or you were one of the elect. You were an elector. We still use the term elect today in a political milieu. Also, you were elevated. You were one of the elevated because you were a worshipper of El, the god Saturn. The study of the Saturnian cult is a whole study in itself. The women specifically were remonstrated with and said that they should listen and pay attention to their god Saturn. So Saturn has rings, so ear rings were put in the ears to commemorate that you were Saturn worshipper. You were married under your god Saturn in the Saturn cult, so you wore the wedding ring. The priests are often seen with the ring, the white ring around their neck. All black, because the planet, everyone who's a Capricorn, anyone who studied the symbols of the sign Capricorn or the planet Saturn know that the color is black and the metal is lead. But the black robe and the white ring represent the ring of Saturn. The old monks used to shave their head at the top so that the hair would be like a ring because they were receiving the light from and the knowledge from their god Saturn, the ringed one. The Jews who worship on Saturday wear the yarmulke, the little round ring. Magic circles. You always drew a magic circle around yourself. In Hebrew, the pregnant women, at certain times when they're about to give birth, a magic circle, a ring, would be drawn around them. The protection of the god Saturn. Many royal symbols in royalty, like the dome, the ring, the globe that is held by the royals, represents also Saturn. Ringing the bell in church. Archangels. That's right. Not only do we have the L in archangel, but the very names of the archangels themselves. Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, Uriel. What's this L bit? It's Gabriel of God. Gabe of El. Because El was the god once upon a time. The very design of churches. From the steeple to the spiral to the bell to the K-bell to the gay-bell to the shingles to the aisle to the navel to the altar. This encodation of the L is that all places we're celebrating to God. The word Bel comes from Baal, B-A-A-L of the Canaanites. And always when you came to worship your god Baal, you rang a bell. Well, we still have that today in the churches, but it's a very old story of ringing the bell to bring the congregation to worship Baal. And even the magic circle that we see in old pictures and we associate with magic has an origin. The rings of Saturn. When we see halos, we understand that the halo does represent the sun around somebody's head, but it also originally represented, it came out of the time when Saturn was king. Saturn was worshipped, and the idea of the ring of Saturn being a very important symbol. The ancients understood that Saturn had rings. They knew many mysteries pertaining to the heavens. The Jews, of course, are the most clearly obvious Saturnian cult, but there are many others. They're part stellar because you have the 7 candelabra, the 7 days of the week. But in a modern context, which is one of the most interesting things to study, we find that the colors of the police uniforms and the judges and the robes and rituals involved in courts, the priests, as I said, with their black robes and white collars, the monks with their shaved heads and robes, and teachers even. The teachers coming out in their black robes, representing Saturn. Everyone in astrology knows that Saturn rules order and discipline and studiousness and patience and matriculation. But the fact that they're dressed also in black and have the square head gear is all coming out of a particular cult, very ancient. We also, like we have a cult of Venus and a cult of Dionysus operating in the world, we also have a priesthood of Saturn operating in the world. And they also can be getting up to no good. Cronus is the other name for Saturn. And from the word Kronos we get chronology, which represents time. Crowns. The idea of a king wearing a crown was that he was a regent under Kronos. He was an agent on earth of Kronos. He turned the rays of the sun inwards, as Jordan Maxwell has pointed out. The rays of the sun turned inwards make a crown, a coronet. Krona, coronet, corona, cron, Karen, they all come from a word. Each of these deities has many symbols attached to it. Now, in a modern context, we find that these strange assassination type happenings and other bizarrities happening on earth, like we went into in Weapons of Mass Deception behind the New World Order, the importance of ritual, satanic ritual that politicians and secret societies are involving themselves in. One stock example that involved the symbolism associated with Saturn was the Heaven's Gate. Remember earlier we were talking about the Heaven's Gates, literally the northern gate of birth and the southern gate of death. Well, that's what these people were referring to. The death gate is Saturn, Capricorn. And sure enough, in that particular ritual, Applegate or Applewhite and his mad cult, we discover many Saturnian symbols. Not only were these people castrated, but you only have to open a book on Greek mythology to find out that Kronos castrated his father. And the sickle is a very, very important hallmark of Saturn worship. We not only find that they dressed all in black, black is the symbol of Saturn. The Nike logo, they all wore Nike gear and Nike shoes. Well, the Nike logo is a subliminal symbol for Saturn. If you look at the logo for Nike, you'll find that it's the edge of the ring of Saturn. But the very name, Heaven's Gate, is enough to put us on to what's really going on here. This is a massive ritual to some ancient deities. Now concerning the lunar cult, Pickett and Prince in their book Templar Revelation say that in the Synoptic Gospels the woman who anoints Jesus is not named, although they make a point that she is a sinner. Mary of Bethany, who did the anointing, was known by the rabbis as Mary Lucifer, Mary the light bringer. So right there we've got a dichotomy. Yes, we know from the stories and the movies and whatnot and from Sunday school and everything else that this sinner, all the disciples hated her guts and didn't know why Jesus was hanging around with her. But then we have in the rabbi tradition, oh no, she's Lucifer, the lady light bringer. And then we do even in the Bible have her mysteriously initiating or anointing Jesus. So which is true? What is going on here? Well, what's going on here is revealed when we analyze the word sinner. Those who've looked at my astro theology page on the website, who've checked into this, know that the word sinner doesn't mean anything negative at all. In this program, we've been talking about how one cult supplanted the others, and one cult becomes the hegemony over another. Well, in that process, the previous cult, together with all of its customs, its traditions, and its belief systems, are considered or thought to be negative. All right? They're demonized by the next cult that comes into power or into ascendancy. The word sinner comes from the word Sin, S-I-N, which was the earliest known name of the moon goddess. She was known as Min, and he was also in Babylon known as a male, Sin, S-I-N. So when you hear the prophets of old, and we hear them remonstrating and saying, "Get thee hence, go and sin no more, get this woman away, she's a sinner," it does not have anything to it doesn't have anything to do with moral or karmic rectitude or imperfection. It simply means this is a female of the lunar cult. So when you hear them say, "Go and sin no more," all they're saying is, "Go and sin no more, don't go and worship sin anymore. Worship the sun, that's all holy, but don't be worshiping the moon. And if you do, you're a sinner." So Eric Newman, the German scholar, says that a favored symbol of the matriarchal sphere is the moon in its relationship to the night and to the great mother, or the night sky, an expression of her essential spirit. As I said earlier, the lunar cult was symbolized by the scarabus beetle of Egypt and the unicorn, the white pale unicorn of the moon, and the northerly sign of Cancer. The scarabus beetle motif comes from Khepra, the Egyptian god of the scarabus beetle, whose sign was when the sun passes to its highest point through Cancer up into Leo, its royal house. Khepra, the god of Egypt. All the lunar cult were distinguished because they'd wear the horns, the lunar horns. Same as the Native American Indians who count time by the many moons. Well, their shaman would wear the lunar horns. And we see Michelangelo, Moses, who, by the way, was the leader in ancient times of the lunar cult, is seen in the sculpture with the lunar horns. It's always perplexed art historians and the Christians. Why is Moses seen with the horns? What could it possibly mean? It means what Michelangelo, being a member of secret societies, understood. And that is that he is the king or the leader of the lunar cult. And he worshipped on Mount Sinai. Sinai was the mountain on which you worship the moon. And this, because of course you have to go high on the mountain to have your observatories and your shrines when you worship the constellations in the heavens. That's why mountains and hills were considered sacred. Moses means from the water. That's all it means. The priestess draws Moses from the water. Now Moses also meant the initiator, the one who initiated with water. On Islamic flags to this day, we'll see the crescent moon. And even though as patriarchal and as fundamentalistic as they may be, their symbols show you where they originally came from. The star and the moon that's on their turrets and their minarets and on their symbols and their flags show you that they originated, like Christianity, from the stellar and the lunar cult. The symbol we use today for money, the so-called dollar bill sign, is a very, very ancient motif coming out from 10,000 years and before, from the time of Egypt. The god, as I said, the color of money was the three colors of the sun, the moon, and the earth. But silver is more predominant than gold. So most of the coins of the world were silver, and most of the money and the coins of the world were dedicated to the moon, because moon is silver, moon is white. And if they're dedicated to the moon, they're obviously dedicated to the goddess of the moon. And the most famous goddess of the moon was Isis. And if you shrink her name, the name of Isis, I-S-I-S, if you compact those together, you will get the American dollar sign. Money, M-O-N-E-Y, Mon, for the moon. The Virgin Mary is always described as having 12 stars in her hair. 12 stars around her head, crowned with 12 stars, and standing on the crescent moon. What could it possibly mean? The Statue of Liberty, the very symbol of America, is Egyptian, comes from Lady Semiramis, or also from Sechet, the Egyptian goddess. So the females of the lunar cult were once the keepers of the gnosis. They understood the mystery of the fauna and the flora, and they were the high initiators. Particularly coming down to us is the Holy Grail motif. The Holy Grail motif, which is picked up in the Christians with the Eucharist and the drinking of the wine. And here's the bread, which is my body, and the wine, which is my blood. But of course what we're not told is that bread is sacred to the female cult, because the 4 ingredients that come to make up bread, yeast, grain, water, and wheat, are all female earth symbols. And the blood of the red wine is very clearly the female menstrual blood. In the tarot we have the suit of cups and the ace of cups, all representing this motif of the chalice as being connected to knowledge. But as time passed and these cults supplant each other, the lunar cult and its representatives become demonic. As the elucidation says, that and the kingdom became dead and desert, for they lost the voices of the wells and of the damsels that were therein. In Divination and the Goddess, we talk very much in that program, in this series, about how women were the keepers of being, where men were more about the keepers of doing, and how women have lost that, which is partly why the world is in the state that it's in. And that in order to even be able to work in society and operate today, the females have to lose their femininity, just as men have lost it, and become more masculinized. And the consequences of that for both the sexes and for the world. Now, as I said, the word mystery comes from the word for woman. It derives from mesta and also from mass, M-A-S. So when you hear about the Christians holding their mass, it's an entirely female rite and ritual coming out of Egypt, the mass. It also gives the mess, M-E-S-S, is an Egyptian word, as in the Catholic Mass. It originally was the circular wafer representing the ovum. So when you see the priest putting that little round white wafer into the believer's mouth, that represents the wafer, which represents the female ovum. So that by you taking it into your body, you will become feminized. He's already dressed in robes of a female, standing in Holy Mother Church with a chalice in one hand, offering you bread with the other. It's all a feminine matriarchal symbol coming from the lunar cult. The word secret comes from the word secretion, implying again the female mysteries, the biology of the female. When we are given a blessing, what we're not told is that comes from blodsen, which means in Teutonic, in Germanic, bleeding. Female again, feminine. Now the tears are oblique references to the divine menstruum. Okay, so the falling of tears of the Jew, and if you look at tarot card number 18, you'll see that the moon goddess is weeping tears. Isis, of course, wept tears for Osiris. Well, the tears are oblique references to the divine menstruum, called the Ku, K-H-U, by the Egyptians. It was the tears which Isis cried over her lost consort Osiris. In alchemical writings, this menstruum was known as the starfire or even the wise blood. It also is the sang grail of the Arthurian legends, carried by 3 maidens. In the Orthodox canon, it appears obliquely as the red wine of the Christian Eucharist. We hear in the Bible that Mary Magdalene is the harlot, but what we don't read is that again is a mistranslation. The word harlot comes originally from Herodolai, but Herodolai means the sacred or beloved one. Ah, is that a change? Harlot comes from Herodolai, meaning she is the sacred one, the beloved one, my beloved one. Now Mary Magdalene, Magdala in Aramaic means tower. Mary Magdalene is known as the Lady of the Tower. But who's the original Lady of the Tower? The original Lady of the Tower was Nephthys, the sister of Isis. If you look on any Egyptian papyri, you'll see Isis, the 2 females, the 2 mothers. Like I said earlier, that all those 2 Marys motifs comes from Isis and Nephthys, the twins. But you'll notice that Isis has her famous headdress, the seat, and beside her stands Nephthys, and her headdress was the tower. So thousands of years before, we have the story of Mary Magdalene, Lady of Magdala, the tower. It's an old re-scripting of Isis and also of Nephthys, the Lady of the Tower. Egyptian. The wedding feast at Cana is the wedding feast of the serpent, of the stellar cult. And at that point, we understand that's now coming to light through the release of the Gnostic Gospels and other deep researches that the marriage feast of Cana was the marriage of Jesus Christ to Mary Magdalene. And that's just as simple as that. The two were wed. These two individuals, it was covered up later, but the idea that even if they're biographical or they're fictional, the idea was that at Cana there was a coming together, a marriage. Now Leonard Shlain, in his book The Alphabet versus the Goddess, says that the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks and Romans had no word in their language for sin. The Israelites introduced both the word and the concept into the stream of Western civilization, and by so doing diverted it. One of the most important female goddess traditions, concepts, was Sophia, called the goddess of wisdom. The word Sophia means wisdom. And Caitlin Matthews lets us know how important Sophia was to the Christians. She says, "It was Rudolf Bultmann, was it not, the German biblical scholar, who cited certain passages in the Gospels as interpolations of Sophia herself, put into the mouth of Christ." The most powerful cult that rules the world from the Grecian times onwards, and possibly even from the 18th dynasty of Egypt onwards, is the solar cult. This is the dominant power through all the ages of the modern, even though of course the solar cult has appropriated many of the symbols, as we've seen, of the lunar and the Saturnian and the stellar cult. The solar cult and the paradigm of thinking that goes with that is the one that is in prominence or is in ascendancy in the modern world. As Schwaller de Lubitsch wrote, the priesthood, and he means the priesthood of Saturn and the Sun, is always will be abusive. One of the main fallacies of Occidental religions is that which espouses that man begins as a sinner and gets to the light by means of conversion involving any number of physical intermediaries. In my book, Introduction to the Tarot's Major Arcana, I say that to the Gnostics and Sophists, this philosophy holds no currency. The Gnostics did not convert sinners, they awakened, they are ready. Erich Fromm, talking of the Old Testament, says, "The document that most powerfully exemplifies an extremely male patriarchal attitude is the Old Testament. It is not surprising that the subject of productiveness, the creation itself, also finds an extreme male solution in its pages. The reason why the Old Testament exhibits such a one-sided male character is that as the primary text of the Jewish monotheism, it represents a male victory over female deities, over the matriarchal remnants in the social structures. The Old Testament is the triumphal hymn of the victorious male religion, a song of victory commemorating the destruction of all traces of matriarchy in religion and society." Leonard Shlain says that about 1500 BC there were hundreds of goddess-based sects enveloping the Mediterranean basin. By the 5th century AD, they had almost been completely eradicated. By then, women were also prohibited from conducting a single major Western sacrament. The oldest temple of the Western world, the Pantheon, is actually dedicated to the female goddess. Lewis Mumford, historian and philosopher, a sociologist, says that out of the early Neolithic complex, a different kind of social organization arose, no longer democratic, that is based on neighborly intimacy, customary usage and consent, but authoritarian, centrally directed, under the control of a dominant minority, no longer confined to a limited territory, but deliberately going out of bounds to seize raw materials and enslave helpless men, to exercise control and exact tribute. This new culture was dedicated not just to the enhancement of life, but to the expansion of collective power. By perfecting new instruments of coercion, the rulers of this society had, by the 3rd millennium BC, organized industrial and military power on a scale that was never to be surpassed until our time. Erich Fromm goes on to say, "The thought that the male can create living beings by himself, with his mouth, through his word, or out of his spirit, is the most unnatural fantasy conceivable. It denies all experience, all reality, every natural condition. It disregards all the laws of nature in order to attain the one goal of presenting the male as the perfect being per se, who possesses the ability life appears to have denied him, the ability to give birth. The first act of creation is the birth of light. Light is always and everywhere a symbol of the male principle." Those who have checked out my astro-theology pages on the website will understand what he means by this. And we go into a description of how light is connected to the male and how light is also used as the weapon intellectual light, psychological light, and also physical light is used in this weaponry, this arsenal of weaponry against the feminine principle. And the feminine principle is not something in women only. It's a principle, a mode of thought, of consciousness of the male as well. We're not talking about male and female here only. We're talking about masculine and feminine, two polarities of even one individual. The Judeo-Christian paradigm comes in to subvert this, to control it, to mess it up. And the atrocity that they've created to create this inner scission, this inner schizophrenia. When we're in this kind of state, it leaves us open to any kind of power dynamics and manipulation. Don't we remember that in the Ten Commandments, in the Old Testament, the Jews are considered the chosen people? Well, they haven't built any pyramids or anything. They're not being honored by God because of their great genius. They're not being honored by God because of their great power inherently. They're being honored by Jehovah, by God, by the big Father, the big Daddy in the sky, because of one thing and one thing only, their obedience. They've been given a Decalogue, they've been given a Ten Commandments, and because they're so obedient to that, they are considered the chosen people. Leonard Shlain, in Alphabet versus the Goddess, says that monotheism does not mirror human society. First, humans are first and foremost social animals, a deity who was alone, not by choice but because there were no other companions for him, was a concept without parallel in human society. The God of the Israelites did not have a wife, a son, a daughter, or a mother. So there you have it. All you need is the masculine principle. Samson, Solomon, David, Abraham, Jesus. The whole list goes on. It's the whole concept of the Sun King. He's alone. He creates by himself. And all are his obedient children. The Israelites are obedient. So today, in our crazy, war-torn world of stress and frustration, if we are obedient to Big Daddy, to Big Father, we will be the chosen ones. It works in ancient times, it works now. And these political leaders, as we saw in other presentations, other programs in this series, they know how to manipulate this. They know how to understand that they want something for giving us protection. And what they want is our obedience. And the more obedient we are, the more humble we are, the more selfless we are, the more likely we'll fall in line, then we will be sure to receive smiles from them. What is the attitude of the slave? What is the master-slave dynamic? It's very simple. The slave knows that the master can completely destroy him. Here's what you call your master, your leaders. These are people who can decimate you, take your very life away. So just in the act of your destruction, we say, don't kill me, I'll be your slave. So the slave and master relationship is born. But you see, the master always sees in the eyes of the servant and the slave the deep hatred that's there. And so eventually the master comes to hate himself because he knows that the whole dynamic, the whole relationship is built on violence and sadism. So not immediately, but over time, even the masters, the leaders, these sadists of the world, by being worshipped, but by being adored in hatred, not out of love, come to despise and hate themselves. Well, what do you think is going to happen in society and culture when these leaders need to vicariously process that hatred? In Weapons of Mass Deception, Behind the New World Order, we talk about this and how the sadist, if he can make his ambiance filled with violence and terror and war and upheaval and filled with enemies, then his own sadism is less apparent. And also another adjunct to that is that they're going to need to process this. It's vital for this inner toxicity to become processed. So the slave is responsible for the horrors that his master does. There's a connection here, a relationship. This is what we're left with when we understand how these cults have worked and what religion is really doing. Now, M. Hester Harding, one of the greatest psychologists the world has ever known, in her book Women's Mysteries says, the rise of masculine power and of patriarchal society probably started when man began to accumulate personal as over against communal, a property, and found that his personal strength and prowess could increase his personal possessions. Okay, so the muscular strength, the muscular power is mentioned here. This change in secular power coincided with the rise of the sun worship under a male priesthood. Sun worship was usually introduced and established by an edict of the military dictator, as happened in Babylon and Egypt, and probably other countries as well. Eric Newman, in his masterpiece, The Origin and Evolution of Consciousness, says, the correlation of consciousness with masculinity culminates in the development of science, as an attempt by the masculine spirit to emancipate itself from the power of the unconscious. We call this path ascent, because we experience consciousness and the world of light as being above us, and the unconscious and darkness as below, still under the spell of the primitive symbolism which associates the upright posture of the human figure with the development of the head and the rest of the higher centers of consciousness. So Newman, like many scholars in this, have thoroughly researched this and understand how the endogenic part of this works, how the interior thinking process, the apparatus of mind, of cognition, also is affected by this, and how up is heaven and down is hell, and how shadow and femininity and nature and children and animals, they're all a waste of time, completely without reason. They don't operate from reason, therefore they're lesser on the ontological scale of things. But God and man and heroes and bloodshed, that's all fine, that's all dandy, that's wonderful. Lawrence van der Post, the sociologist, in his Jung and the Story of Our Times, says that the history of civilization appears to be a sorry, one-sided history of domination by man. Almost invariably, the basic cultural pattern has been the work of man. Whole areas of history are darkened by the ignorance of man of the truth that they can create only through the feminine in their own natures, just as they can procreate in the world without the woman alone. Those familiar with my writings, especially on the tarot and the meanings of the different tarot cards, understand that I've gone into this also. That technology, science, is nothing but man's Frankensteinian, warped nightmare to try and mimic that all-important power that he doesn't have. Women give birth to children. Well, God gives birth to the human race, but somehow he's favored women with the power to give birth. Man doesn't have it. So, not immediately, but over time, compounded by the ages, man wants to rival the power, the procreative power of the female. His methodology of doing that is technology and science and cybernetics. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, in his book The Ultimate Canon of Knowledge, he says, it needs no dissertation to elaborate and certify what the record of history reveals as to this portent obsession with the dour religious consciousness over the centuries. It has left its lamentable record in the tale of corruption, banality, superstition, bigotry, and general moral and mental blight that overspread the area of Christian Europe over the middle period, which has come to be known as the Dark Ages. David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, says its name is progress, and the dream of progress continues to fuel global civilization's expansion everywhere, converting human beings into mechanized, self-obliterating puppets, and nature into dead statuary. William A. Kotke says in his Final Empire, the civilized people believe they have an obligation to bring primitive and underdeveloped people up to their level. Civilization, which is about to self-destruct, thinks of itself as the superior culture that has answers for all the world's peoples. The addict truly is a person who is emotionally dependent on things, television, substances, personality routines, other people, mental ideologies, total immersion in some cause or work. If the object of dependency is moved, addicts will experience insecurity, discomfort, distress, the symptoms of withdrawal. Well, as we've been pointing out in other programs like Weapons of Mass Deception, these symptoms are being withdrawn. There's a death happening, the death of the middle class, and there's going to be withdrawal symptoms taking place in the very near future. The Maya predicted it, and it's on its way. And unless we get back to what is real, culturally, biologically, psychologically, there's not going to be much left to work with. Eric Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says these social and political changes were accomplished by a profound change in the role of women in society and of the mother figure in religion. No longer was the fertility of the soul the source of all life and creativity, but the intellect, which produced new inventions, techniques, abstract thinking, and the state with its laws. No longer the womb, but the mind became the creative power. And thus, simultaneously, not women, but men dominated society. He goes on to say, it was Johann Jacob Bachofen professor of Roman law at Basel, who presented the first major challenge to the naive beliefs that patriarchal society was a natural state of affairs and that man's superiority to women was a self-evident matter. But Aristotle, he said the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind. So here you have it, the greatest philosophers. Of course you're going to believe it. The greatest philosophers in the world are telling you it all, that the male is superior. We're in the 21st century now. Maybe we can, finally refute this nonsense. Mark Nathan Cohen, in his book, The Health and Rise of Civilization, civilization, he said, has not been as successful in guaranteeing human well-being as we would like to believe, at least for most of our history. There is no evidence either from ethnographic accounts or archaeological excavations to suggest that rates of accidental trauma or interpersonal violence declined substantially with the adoption of more civilized forms and political organization. In fact, some evidence from archaeological sites and from historical sources suggests the opposite. Leonard Schlein points out that Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish scientist, he actually displaced Mother Earth from the center of the universe and replaced her with Father Sun. So again, you can see as these things start to happen down through the centuries, eventually the male psyche starts to warp reality and starts to compound the problem. John Zerzan, in his Elements of Refusal, says that when Descartes enunciated the principle that the fullest exploitation of matter to any use is the whole duty of man, our separation from nature was virtually complete, and the stage set for the coming of the Industrial Revolution. 350 years later, this spirit still lingers in the person of Jean Vorst, curator of France's Museum of Natural History, who pronounces that our species, because of intellect, can no longer recross a certain threshold of civilization and once again become part of the natural habitat. He further states, expressing perfectly the original and persevering imperialism of agriculture, that as the earth in its primitive state is not adopted for our expansion, man must shackle it to fulfill human destiny. And Sir Francis Bacon, in his Novo Organum, the New Organism, says that consistently he used metaphors derived from the witch hunt and the torture chamber to describe how scientists should force nature to relinquish her secrets. Theodore Roszak, the American scholar, in his book Where the Wasteland Ends, says the astronautical image of man, and that it is nothing but the quintessence of urban industrial society's pursuit of the wholly controlled, wholly artificial environment, amounts to a spiritual revolution. This is man as he has never lived before. It draws the line through human history that almost assumes the dimensions of an evolutionary turning point. So it has been identified by Teilhard de Chardin, who has given us the concept of the noosphere, a level of existence that is to be permanently dominated by human intellect and planning, and which our species must now adapt if it is to fulfill its destiny. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says a study of Christian history discloses the portentous fact that the concept of the malignancy of matter coming into the movement of Hinduism through Zoroastrianism became an influence overwhelmingly dominating the theology and the ethic. It bred the monstrous cult of asceticism, whose driving motivation was the idea that the instincts of the flesh must be crushed down in the interests of the spirit. The tragic consequence of this staggering default of insight are incalculable, but in all conscience overwhelming to any intelligence that discerns it. It lay the Christian mind open to the obsession of a psychological influence that has been nothing less than devastating to sanity, inflicting upon the psyche a trauma that has produced morbidity and crushed to a degree the natural instincts for human happiness. But that's what this whole blitzkrieg on the human psyche was meant to do. To suppress the feminine, to alienate you from the earth, to think that God is up in the cloud somewhere and he's also wrathful. He's also an all-stern father figure who's judging your every move. To get you to be so schizoid, pathological, and existentially derempt that you wouldn't even be able to fashion your own destiny, your own thoughts. Erich Fromm, in his Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, says, "The deep need of man not to feel lost and lonely in the world had of course been previously satisfied by the concept of a God who had created this world and was concerned with each and every creature. But for many of those for whom God was dethroned, the need for a godlike figure did not disappear. Some proclaimed a new God, evolution, and worshipped Darwin as his prophet." I added this because I want to make it stressed that just because you maybe have put aside one lie, like you don't believe in God, or say for instance you are not very religious, be aware that it's not just as simple as that. You may have other deities that you worship in exactly the same way, which also engender this pathogenic type of thinking pattern. Material thinking in general, the worship of money, of power, all does the same thing. Now, Mark Brownstein says, where religion brought hate and called it the search for divine love, science brings death and calls it the quest for eternal life. I write that the expulsion from Eden meant the loss of the symbiotic connection with nature and the universal order, the scission between the microcosm and the microcosm, between psychic energy and physical energy. So it's poetic, I know, but we can think of that expulsion, that falling out of paradise of Eden, as literally being disconnected from the earth. Ergo, the return to the earth and the return to the philosophy and the ordinances, to be more obedient to the laws and the inherent subtle ordinances and principles and laws of nature, of the earth, will signal the apple being put back on the tree of life, and also the return of sanity to the mind of man. Genesis 3 we read, "Because thou," and they're talking about Eve, not the serpent, "because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou wilt go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." In the Lament of Sophia, from the ancient Gnostic book, the Pistis Sophia, it says, "They have taken my light from me, and my power is dried up. I have forgotten my mystery, which heretofore I was wont to accomplish. I am become as a demon apart, who dwelleth in matter, and light is not in him." And we all know the idea of Lilith being banished and call it demoness. Lilith is nothing more than the healthy masculine aspect of the feminine. See, we accept the feminine, we accept Eve, do we not? We accept Mary, but it's this soft, pliable, recumbent, completely submissive principle. It's okay as a mother. It's okay as a whore, as a sinner. But to have the strong female and the strong feminine within, no, that's prohibited. That's taboo. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, he says, "The influence of the book has done nothing to mitigate the virulence of the Western religion's bias against nature. Its glorification of the person and function in the history of the Son of God has in effect diverted all interest in the religious field away from man's relationship to nature." And Erich Fromm points out the consequences to this. Man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biological, non-adaptive, and non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and the danger to man's existence as a species. He says the most ample and horrifying documentation of seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction, in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. George P. Marsh, in his book of The Earth as Modified by Human Action, says that but man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned into discords. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn again, he says, thinking which does not start from and continue in close relation to its foundations in the physical universe must lead to falsity. Erich Fromm says, in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, that's necrophilia, seems to develop in the new urban civilization. Michael Elner says that just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health. Lawyers destroy justice. Universities destroy knowledge. Governments destroy freedom. The major media destroys information. And religion destroys spirituality. Caitlin Matthews, the Celtic scholar, writes, "Our exile has not only been from the goddess, but also from nature. It is not surprising, considering that most Westerners live apart from their environment, protected by concrete roadways, consuming machine-processed foods and filled with media information to the detriment of the experience of their own senses. The seasons go unnoticed. We seldom touch the earth, or eat fresh food, or observe the world personally. The sacred is a forgotten dimension in our society, which we ignore at our peril." And David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, says something which has always affected me very profoundly. He says, we reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually, beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we are embedded that all we can do is navigate our way cautiously through a humanly designed, day-to-day substitute world of symbols. It's a world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel. And that is what is happening. That is what is occurring in the next 10 years. There is going to be what Nietzsche referred to as the return of the repressed. One, whether it's from worshipping false leaders, or from not doing one's own spiritual inner work, or as these scholars are saying, whether it's from being cut off from nature or suppressing our feminine side, from all of these and many more reasons, there's a build-up of toxicity in the unconscious. And at some point, it's all needing to be processed. It's all going to come out. In the program we did called 2012, we looked at the fact that there's shadow work. Normally, a healthy individual will do what is called shadow work to process some of this dark content and may graduate spiritually as a result, become more adjusted to life. But there's times when simple shadow work is not enough, and other archetypes then take the lead. And those archetypes are, again, the Great Father, the all-powerful masculine archetype that leads its derelict children in the direction that it wants to go, which creates enemies and wants to destroy those enemies. And like in a sort of a Dr. Strangelove scenario, wants to drop atom bombs and cause all manner of havoc in order to expatiate and exorcise all of our own darkness and disturb psychic content. We may wonder if the overwhelming success of linear perspectives as the sole definition of visual reality isn't a symptom of some deeper condition seeking expression. And we might ask, why did some humans create and then rationalize with elaborate devices, ideologies and defenses, an unprecedented way of seeing the world based on distancing and detachment? Could it be that the linear perspective that infuses our vision, from our glorification of intellectual distancing to our debunking of earlier realms of feeling and intuition, to our relentless lifting upward with skyscrapers and space shuttles, to the ultimate techno-utopian vision of downloading human knowledge into self-perpetuating computers to make embodied life obsolete, that such a perception is the result of some traumatic violation that happened in our human past? So again, the idea of trauma in the ancient past. Now, in this age, in this time, we're going to have to discover that if we realize that when we were close to nature, not close to the concrete and the steel, but when we were close to nature, when we lived amongst the shamans, when we had people who understood and took care of our psychological welfare as opposed to just our physical and intellectual welfare, that we went through rites and rituals that helped us to process all of this dark content. You see, our world today is void of any of these rituals. In fact, the only rituals that were provided are sinister ones, which only make the problem worse. Bradley A.T. Pask, in his book Rape, the book Rape and Ritual, says, depreciation and loathing of women, her body, and by extension the feminine, has been expressed repeatedly by our intellectual and psychological forefathers. In the Gospel of Thomas, St. Peter is meant to say, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." And Tertullian, the church father, patriarch, says, "Woman, you are the gateway of the devil. Because of you, the Son of God had to die." Well, that's very peculiar, isn't it? Because 5 minutes later, they're setting up in the Christian church the image of Virgin Mary, the sacred mother of Jesus. But then you turn to passages where Jesus is rebuking his mother, going, "Get thee behind me, I have no mother." Which is it? We've got so much contradiction here, we can't make up our minds. In Techniques of Persuasion, the scholar J.A.C. Brown writes that thus the tendency of religions to suppress the natural expressions of the sexual drive would seem to indicate a subconscious awareness of the fact that when normal outlets are allowed, sublimation into religious feeling is less likely to occur. One cannot help but notice the predominant role played by unmarried women in the Christian church, or the visible loss of enthusiasm for religious interests on the part of happily married women. Many have noticed the common use in devotional works of sexual symbolism and the tendency to express religious feeling in erotic imagery, even to the extent of describing what in another context would be taken as an account of sexual orgasm. Eric Newman says that for a while, the specific achievement of the male world lies in the development of the masculine consciousness and the rational mind. The female psyche is in far greater degree dependent on the productivity of the unconscious. So what is this scholar telling us? He's saying that the feminine, what we call the feminine principle, is aligned with or commensurate with the unconscious part of us, and that consciousness is the ego waking consciousness. But as scholars like and scientists like Bruce Lipton have pointed out, we are motivated entirely by the unconscious. Consciousness makes up only the smallest quotient of our psyche. So if we suppress the unconscious, not working with it, we're already in a schizoid state from that point on. Carl Jung, in Approaching the Unconscious, says that modern man does not understand how much his rationalism, quote unquote, has put him at the mercy of the psychic underworld. He has freed himself from superstition, or so he believes, but in the process he has lost his spiritual values to a positively dangerous degree. His moral and spiritual tradition has disintegrated, and he is now paying the price for his breakup in a worldwide disorientation and disassociation. But that's all right. The pharmaceutical industry is run by the cult of Dionysus. They'll help. They've got answers. All you need is medication, pharmaceuticals, designer drugs. They'll take care of it. Now, Chellis Glendenning, in his book My Name is Chellis and I'm Recovering from Western Civilization, says that Terry Kellogg emphasized the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them towards ourselves or other people or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behaviors because something unnatural has happened to them and they've become deranged. That's right, we are basically schizoid, we're deranged, and we are going to either project our sadism on others, or masochistically we introject the violence and the horror and the frustration and tensions that we feel. Loosely they say that women tend to introject their self-hate or their world hate, and men tend to project it. This of course is because men are allowed to box each other and play competitive sports down through the centuries, so they're more likely to do it in an external way. It's considered less taboo. Whereas women have been prevented from that, so their tendency is to overeat and beat on their children and whatnot, and get into all other manner of dysfunctions. But the same root exists. It's the same origin to all these dysfunctions, regardless of whether it's introjected or projected. The problem is the same. Now, J.A.C. Brown, in his Techniques of Persuasion, lets us understand something about the nature of religion. He says that at a Calvinist revival meeting around the year 1800, in the meeting which followed in 1801, 20,000 men, women and children assembled outdoors and listened to the doctrine of hellfire and eternal damnation for the unrepentant. Almost immediately, excitement broke out. Some ran about shrieking in agony, or rolled on the ground for hours at a time. Others rushed into the surrounding forest crying, "Lost, lost," at the full pitch of their voices. Convulsive jerking movements began amongst many, and spread like a contagion throughout the congregation and elsewhere. Groups of men and women went through the process known as treeing the devil, where they crawled around on all fours, barking and snarling at each other for long periods of time. Another phenomenon was the so-called frog hopping, when both men and women occupied themselves by frenziedly leapfrogging over each other. As might be expected, many in the final phases of the meeting went into trance or had visual hallucination and ended up by taking part in sexual excesses. He says in 18th century France, in a convent, one nun began to mew like a cat until presently the whole community was mewing day after day until stopped by the threats of the local militia, and the biting mania which spread through the convents of Germany, Holland and Italy. In the latter case, powerful excitement manifested itself not only in biting, but in indecent exposure, tearing their hair out by the roots, and group howling and gnashing of teeth. He has a statement in his book from Martin Luther. Martin Luther writes, "When my heart is cold and I cannot pray as I should, I scourge myself with the thought of the impiety and ingratitude of my enemies, the Pope and his accomplices and vermin, so that my heart swells with righteousness and hatred, and I can say with warmth and vehemence, Holy be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And the hotter I grow, the more ardent do my prayers become." St. Augustine wrote, "Meanwhile my sins were being multiplied, and my concubine being torn from my side as a hindrance to my marriage, my heart which clave unto her was torn and wounded and bleeding. To thee be praise, glory to thee, fountain of mercies. I was becoming more miserable, and thou nearer." Because Augustine was thinking of getting married, and his mother told him that can't be, and he, of course, had to abstain. And here we read that he's getting closer to God as he's getting sadder and more miserable at his sexual repression. Now, the New England preacher John Edwards said that the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as we hold a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. Edwards was saying, as innocent as children seem to us, if they are out of Christ, they are not so in God's sight, but are young vipers, and are infinitely more hateful than vipers, and are in the most miserable condition. And sure enough, this kind of mania and repression coming out in a projected form as sexual degeneracy, criminality, and utter sadism is a well-known motif when we look into the pages of history, whether it's the atrocities of kings or sadist maniacs like Vlad the Impaler and Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or Gilles de Rais or Stalin, or modern maniacs. As Niccolo Machiavelli said, since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. Well, that's right, everything is on its head now, everything is twisted round now, everything is inside out now. Sure. But where does it all originate? This is what we've been trying to demonstrate in this program. Leonard Shlain in Sex, Time and Power says, when asked, most men will gallantly express their admiration for women in general and profess a profuse love for their mates in particular. Despite these touching personal testimonials, society is rife with misogyny and patriarchy. A cursory glance at the current newspapers or television news reveals a global society in which the majority of men disdain women. While some cultures are more egalitarian than others, men's actions suggest that they believe firmly in their superiority over women. Eric Newman, in his book On the Moon and Matriarchal Consciousness, says any development at any stage that strives towards patriarchal consciousness, towards the sun, looks on the moon spirit as the spirit of regression, as the terrible mother, as a witch. Leonard Shlain, in his book The Alphabet versus the Goddess, the Babylonians elevated to the supreme position a god who had conquered and then mutilated a goddess. Patriarchy, he says, is the dominant theme in Hammurabi's code. Sons are commanded to obey their fathers, not their mothers. And sure enough, we have the Canaanite god Moloch, to whom the little children are sacrificed. Now in Christianity, we've been seeing that we have a lot of pagan motifs. But one of the most beloved symbols that is in Christianity is, of course, that of the Christmas tree. But the Christmas tree comes out of the pagan past also. In those days it was known as Yggdrasil, or the world tree, that had its roots in the earth and its branches in the heavens. It was the tree between heaven and earth, or the polar axis. And of course in religion, we always hear that the mystic or the prophet is near a tree. Lord Buddha, of course, in the famous Bodhi tree. We have Jesus in the baptism, and the medieval artists are showing the proximity of the tree of life, the fig tree and the olives. Lord Krishna always used to play his flute with the cowgirls under the tree. And Christianity, the cross originally had a serpent around it. It was the great tree. Moses sets up his brazen serpent, the tree of life and the serpent, a primordial Christian symbol. And of course the crucifix upon which Jesus is crossed was known as the tree of Golgotha. And in the tarot cards and all through mythology we see the image of the tree, the sacred tree. The tree of life is shown in the tarot cards behind the female principle. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings we also see in that book a great deal of mention of the elven tree and the tree of Gondor, the tree that has lost all its leaves and is dark and ruined while evil is abroad, but then that comes to life again as light and truth comes back into the world. In the Bible we have the tree of good and evil, or the tree of life, which contains the fruit of forbidden knowledge. We find that Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent by visitors to Egypt. In Egypt they had also the tree of the north and the tree of the south, or the two trees, and they were also known as the Jed pillars, because there was a priestarchy called the Jedi in Egypt. And the Jed pillar was the missing phallus of Osiris, but it really represented the Kundalini and the raising of the Kundalini energy. That comes down to us in more modern times as the caduceus of Hermes, the two opposing serpent forces that you see on the medical monopolies today. But the symbol goes back to Nuth, who was literally the tree of life. So yes, we have the tree of life motif, but it goes back to the old palmyriums of Egypt, and it goes further back so that the body of the female goddess is the tree of life. And that's where we get the word nuts. When you go and pick nuts, berries, nuts from the tree, that comes from Nuth, or Nut, the Egyptian goddess who was the tree of life. The ovums of her womb are the seeds that give birth to life. In Egypt specifically, but not only in Egypt do you see the presence of the female goddess in proximity to the tree of life. Being the tree of life and being the keeper of the ovum and being the keeper of the mystery of being, here we see the whole story in an old papyrus where we have the old story of Adam and Eve. There's Adam, the Pharaoh, sitting on the chair in a recumbent and submissive position, being instructed in the mysteries by Virgo, the virgin, with the wheat sheaves on her head and the ovum in her hand. And that ovum, by the way, is the apple. In ancient times it was known that the apple from the forbidden tree of life, the apple was always known as the ovum of the female. And the little wriggling serpent that comes to tempt or to eat the apple or to bite into the apple was nothing more than the spermatozoon. The male sperm, which looks like a little wriggling snake or serpent, was in proximity to the ovum. So this is conception. But magically speaking, conception had other meanings. It had the meaning of the uniting of the masculine and feminine within the self. Androgyny. Not on a genital level, but on a spiritual level. And the mystery of this process, the mystery of these rites and rituals was always in the keeping of the female, of the Eves. So in the Egyptian papyrus we have the Adam and Eve story of Eve being the priestess initiator, offering the ovum to the male in the original Eucharist. Here again we see the interaction, that the Pharaoh, Adam the male, is a little apprehensive. There's the tree of life on the right. the fourfold tree of life, the tree of consciousness, the tree of the spine, and the tree of the cerebral spinal cortex. And the initiation. Now the lion chair that you see him sitting on is really the Panthera chair. The ancient priests used to wear the robes of the jaguar or the panther. In fact, the Semitic name for Jesus in the Talmud is Yeshua ben Panthera, because the panther skin was a symbol of the high priests. That was their logo or their emblem. Now the tree of life represented man's intimate umbilical rapport with nature and the universal order. Its forbidden fruit refers to the sustenance by being non-differentiated from nature. What man considers his independent self, his independence, is merely hyper-alienation from himself and from the world. His ability to tolerate such an existential predicament has been increased by the conditioning of false theocracies which have created intricate surrogate pacifiers for the lost reality which he inwardly misses and craves. Man's attachment to these simulacras become the reason for further alienation. The spell is broken only for those whose inner voice is heard over the clamor of lies that besiege the brain and senses from all quarters. So your average serial killer, maniac, murderer type is the male who's secretly crying out for bonding with the feminine. But he's also got a love-hate relationship, a masculine, a sadomasochistic relationship with the feminine. He both desires it, but he also despises it. So the artists will paint the female picture. The female image is the most prevalent motif in art. So it can be adored, but it can also be slaughtered and murdered, because the dichotomy has been set up. We have an ambivalent connection, not only to external females, where those who want to project this crime and violence, it comes out on external females, but the violence is already happening morally. The violence is already happening in an introjected way within the self to one's own feminine principle. And psychologists understand this. We can observe this in the ones around us. And we can also examine and notice all the reinforcements, all the ways in which culture and our parents and our peers and our priests and our politicians are emphasizing this and engendering this dichotomy within. And if we buy into it, we will be the sucker. We will be the ones who are totally, have our own republic torn to shreds. The Son of God, as the sun above us in the heavens. Jordan Maxwell, in Ancient Belief Systems, says, if one also replaces the word son, S-O-N, with the word sun, S-U-N, wherever the former is found in the Bible, it will be discovered that every single verse fits the literal son and not a man. In fact, the verses make better sense. That's right. Every time you see the word Son of God or the word Jesus, just in your mind, put there the word S-U-N and think of the Son. And suddenly the Bible will come alive. And every passage not only fits, but makes better sense than if it was a biography. And that is how the mythographers who've painted the image of Jesus are showing you. The rays of the sun, the red cross of the equinox, standing on the clouds, haloed with the sun and the cross of the zodiac, the light of the world. Behold, he cometh with clouds, says Revelation 1. Yes, the sun does come with clouds. The Christians to this day in the churches raise their arms, and the old symbol of the Ka. Open any book on Egyptian mythology and look, and you'll see the gods raising their arms, and that is known as the Ka, the K-A, when you raise your arms like that to symbolize the soul. But just on the most primitive level, just observe the artwork. Just look at the imagery that is being shown to you. The Christ haloed with light. Our Father who art in heaven. We end our prayers with Amen, which literally meant the Son God. The words of Jesus in Revelation 22, I am the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star. Jordan Maxwell has pointed out many times that many of the patriarchs also correspond to the Son. Solomon, the name of Solomon is actually made up of three phonemes 3 syllables that mean the name of the sun in the 3 ancient languages of the world. Sol is the Anglo-Saxon for sun. Om is the Hindu. And On is the Egyptian. Now the Egyptians had a city of light in the north called Heliopolis, that the Greeks call Heliopolis, city of the sun. But before the Greeks got there and changed the name, that city was called in Egypt On, O-N, the city of light.